He looked at me with cold eyes and said, "Stop acting like a king in my house." Then he threw a glass of water in my feet and the room went silent. I didn't shout, I didn't move. I just felt something inside me break. That night, I realized the man I had spent my whole life building up no longer saw me as a father, but as a burden. And that was the moment everything changed. Before we dive into today's story, I recommend you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. If you enjoy this video, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0 to let me know how I can make better content for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. I was born on the south side of Cleveland, where winters bit through steel and men learned early that talk didn't pay bills. My first job was at 16, hauling rebar at the old Lakeview plant. I liked the noise of iron. It made sense to me. Metal bends when you know its limits, but it breaks when you get arrogant. I lived my life by that rule. My hands built frames that held up schools, bridges, and apartment towers across Ohio. But my real project was smaller, raising a son who'd never have to break his back like I did. When Marianne and I married, we didn't have much. One used car, a rented flat, and a second-hand couch with a tear in the arm. But we had plans. She taught high school English, I worked 6 days a week. When our boy Ethan came along, I started picking up overnight shifts. I remember bringing home his first winter coat, blue with yellow buttons. Marianne said I looked prouder than when we bought our first house. I wasn't much of a talker, but I showed love through work. If my family was warm and fed, I slept easy, no matter how sore my hands were. Years rolled on like freight trains. I taught Ethan to ride his bike by the frozen edge of Lake Erie, his wobbling tires cutting tracks into the slush. We built a sled out of scrap beams, painted it red, and called it the Rocket. He laughed every time he crashed into a snowbank. Back then, I thought laughter like that could last a lifetime. I thought love, once earned, stayed fixed like welded steel. When Ethan grew up, he talked about starting an HVAC company. I sold my fishing boat and pulled a chunk from my 401k to help. "You'll build something better than me," I told him. He hugged me, promised he would. That was enough for me. I didn't ask for repayment, just respect. After Marianne passed, the house felt like a workshop after closing. Quiet, hollow, full of ghosts. Ethan suggested we buy a duplex. He and Madison could take the front. I'd stay in the rear unit. "That way you're close, Dad," he said. It sounded good. I liked hearing family through the wall, the thump of grandkids' feet upstairs, the smell of Sunday pancakes drifting back. I planted grapes along the fence, built a smoker out of an oil drum. I thought I was building permanence. To make things simple, I set up the Briggs Family Revocable Trust. My lawyer told me it would keep taxes clean. Everything stayed in my name: house, savings, CDS, even the investments from my retirement plan. But Ethan's name sat beside mine on the checking account. "He'll learn responsibility," I said. The lawyer nodded, but I saw hesitation in his eyes. I should have asked what he was thinking. Neighbors called me generous. "You raised a solid man," the pastor said once, and I smiled. I didn't tell him that sometimes Ethan corrected me mid-sentence when I mixed up his kids' names, or that Madison sighed when I switched channels to the ball game. Those things felt small, like squeaks in an old hinge. I thought respect could rust a little and still hold. My days followed a rhythm. Coffee at 6, fix something broken by 8, watch the neighborhood kids race their bikes down Ridge Road. Ethan ran his business from a bright white van with his logo on the side, Briggs Air, comfort you can trust. I was proud every time I saw it parked out front. Pride, I learned later, can blind you worse than fog. At night, I'd sit by the window, hearing the muffled laughter from the other unit. I told myself the distance was good. Young families needed space. Sometimes Ethan invited me over for dinner. Other times, I heard plates clatter and didn't get a knock. I never questioned it. You don't want to admit your son might be drifting from you. It feels like confessing failure. One winter evening, snow piled against the porch rail. I caught my reflection in the glass, lined face, gray hair, the same hands that built everything he stood on. I thought of Marianne, how she'd tell me not to spoil the boy, and how I'd just smile. Maybe she'd been right. That night, the furnace hummed like a steady heart. I looked around my quiet half of the house, the tools neatly lined on the wall, and felt something I couldn't name. Peace mixed with a faint unease. A man can outlive many aches, I thought, but not the day his own blood forgets what he bled for. I didn't know it yet, but the first crack had already formed, running silent through the steel of our family. If you're still watching and this moment hit you deep, drop a number 1 in the comments so I know you're here with me. What happens next will completely shift everything he thought he knew. Autumn came early that year. The grape leaves behind my duplex browned at the edges before September was even done. I told myself the weather had changed, not the soil, though deep down I knew better. The vines were dying because I hadn't been tending to them as much. Every time I went outside, I felt like an extra in someone else's yard. My days had fallen into a quiet rhythm. I'd wake up before sunrise, make black coffee in the old percolator, and sweep the back steps. The smell of bacon and toast drifted from the front unit, Ethan's side, but the door never opened for me. Sometimes I'd hear Madison laughing too loud at something on her phone, or Ethan telling the kids to hurry up or they'd be late. I used to love that sound, the hum of a young family. Now it just reminded me how far away I lived while sharing the same roof. The small things came first. Ethan stopped saying good morning unless I spoke first. He began to correct me mid-sentence, especially in front of others. When a neighbor stopped by to borrow a ladder, Ethan said, "Sure, my dad's got one." The words didn't hurt until he added, "You can leave it by my garage when you're done." That ladder was mine, like most tools in this house, but I just nodded. It wasn't worth arguing over steel and wood when the real weight sat in my chest. Madison's tone shifted too. She treated me like an uninvited guest who hadn't gotten the hint to leave. If I lingered in the living room too long, she'd switch off the TV and say she needed quiet. When friends visited, she'd joke, "Don't mind the old man, he's part of the rent." They laughed, not realizing how the words pressed down harder than the cold on my bones. I'd pretend not to hear, but I always did. The bank messages stopped coming regularly. At first, I thought it was the carrier. Then I noticed Ethan checking his phone whenever I mentioned the accounts. "All good, Dad," he'd say, too quickly. I told myself he was just managing things more actively than I could. After all, I'd trusted him with the access. Still, something in his tone bothered me. The casual ownership, the unspoken assumption that everything with my name was really his. I started cooking dinners again, simple stews and roasts like Marianne used to make. I'd invite them over, but Madison always had a reason. Diet, appointments, plans. The few times Ethan came alone, he scrolled through his phone more than he spoke. When I offered leftovers to the kids, he said, "They're fine, Dad." Don't fuss. His dad didn't sound like love anymore. It sounded like an obligation. At church, people still told me how lucky I was to have a son who takes such good care of me. I smiled and said, "Yeah, he's doing well." No point correcting them. In a small town like Parma, stories spread faster than truth. Better to keep the picture tidy. Pride and privacy, two walls that trapped me just as tightly as guilt. One Sunday, I walked out back to prune the vines and saw Ethan talking to a friend by the fence. He didn't see me. I heard him laugh and say, "Yeah, he's living in my house now. I keep an eye on him, make sure he doesn't do anything stupid." They both laughed. I froze mid-step, my pruning shears hanging open. The words echoed louder than any argument. My house. I waited until they drove off before I went inside. I wrote those two words on a scrap of paper, my house, and pinned it above my workbench. I stared at them for a long time. The question mark looked like a hook, ready to tear something loose. I noticed the cracks everywhere after that. Madison folded my laundry and left it on the porch rail instead of knocking. The grandchildren stopped saying thank you when I fixed their bikes. The wall between our units seemed thinner when they laughed and thicker when I knocked. Even the light bulb above my bench began to flicker, stubbornly refusing to stay bright. At night, I sat by the small window in my workshop. watching the wind pull the last leaves from the vines. The yard looked emptier each evening, the trellis bare like an old rib cage. I thought about Marianne and how she used to say, "A family is like a garden. You have to water it, even when you're tired." I had watered mine with years of labor, but someone had salted the ground when I wasn't looking. I didn't confront Ethan. I didn't shout or slam doors. Men like me don't make scenes. We endure them. But inside, something shifted. A small click, like a lock turning. I began to understand that respect doesn't vanish in a single blow. It erodes, quiet and steady, until one day you realize you're standing ankle deep in what used to be your foundation. That night, I sat in the dark, listening to laughter seep through the wall. I told myself it was just the way families grow apart. But deep down, I knew the truth. I hadn't lost my son's attention. I'd lost his respect. And respect, once gone, doesn't come back with an apology. It has to be rebuilt, bolt by bolt, or torn down entirely. If you're still watching and feeling the weight of what's unfolding, comment number 2 below to show you're following along. What's coming will make you question how far patience can really go. The night it happened was ordinary in every way that should have made it safe. Snow pressed against the windows, the furnace hummed, and the smell of chicken stew drifted through the house. Madison moved between kitchen and table, setting plates with the efficiency of someone performing a chore, not a kindness. The kids were restless, clicking spoons against their bowls. I sat at the end of the table, the quiet seat I'd learned to claim, waiting until everyone else was served before touching a bite. Ethan talked through most of dinner, half to himself, half to his phone. He complained about clients, the economy, the price of gas, anything that reminded everyone he was the one keeping this house running. I kept my eyes on my food. Over the years, I'd learned that interruptions, even well-meant ones, turned into lectures. Madison nodded along as if his words were gospel, her eyes flicking toward me when he mentioned bills. He said, "This winter's killing me. 2 trucks need new compressors, payroll's tight. You know how much it costs just to keep the lights on in this place?" I wanted to tell him I still paid the property taxes, that the lights burned because I replaced the wiring myself last spring. But the words stayed behind my teeth. Every sentence felt like walking barefoot on ice. One wrong step, and you fall through. I took small bites, slow and polite. The kids finished first, asking for dessert. Madison gave them cookies, ignoring the untouched bread on my plate. When the noise settled, I realized I was still hungry. The bowl of rice sat near Ethan's elbow. I hesitated, then said quietly, "Could I have a little more rice?" It was a simple question, but silence fell like a dropped tool in an empty shop. Madison froze mid-reach. The children stopped talking. Ethan's jaw tightened. For a moment, I thought he hadn't heard me. Then his hand moved. He picked up his water glass, leaned forward across the table, and flung the water straight into my face. The shock stole my breath. The cold hit first, then the sound, the quick slap of liquid, the clatter of silverware, the sharp gasp from one of the kids. The water ran down my shirt and into my lap, soaking through the fabric. I stared at him, waiting for a laugh, for a, "Just kidding." It didn't come. Ethan's voice was flat. "Enough. Stop acting like a king in my house." My house. The same words he'd said to his friend by the fence weeks before. They landed harder this time, as if the water carried them straight into my bones. Madison gave a nervous laugh. "Oh, come on, Ethan," she said, but she didn't sound sorry. The children giggled, unsure if they were allowed to. The sound turned my stomach. I reached for a napkin, wiped my face, and said nothing. My hand trembled, not from age, but from trying to hold back something heavier than anger. The rice on my plate had turned to paste. I kept my eyes down. I could have shouted. I could have told him about the nights I skipped meals so he could eat, about the years I froze my hands stiff on job sites to pay for his schooling, about the savings he thought were his because I'd trusted too easily. But shouting would have made me small. And humiliation, I realized, is quieter than rage. I sat there until everyone else was done eating. They talked about TV shows, weekend errands, anything but what had happened. The water dried on my shirt, but the sting stayed. When Madison cleared the table, she moved around me like I wasn't there. I stood, slow and careful, and walked toward my unit without a word. The laughter followed me down the hall. My shoes left wet prints on the floorboards. I closed my door behind me, locking it for the first time since moving in. In the mirror, my reflection looked older than it had that morning. Water still glistened in my hair, the lines around my mouth carved deeper. I pressed my fingers against the sink to stop them shaking. For a long time, I stared at the man in the glass. The one who had built this home, raised that boy, and somehow ended up begging for rice. I thought about the years of work. The cranes, the welding sparks, the smell of steel dust, the long drives home in frozen boots. Every memory burned hotter than the one before, until all that remained was clarity. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window and listened to the furnace hum, thinking about silence. I'd always believed silence meant strength, that holding your tongue was a form of control, but now I understood something darker. Silence can also be surrender, and I had surrendered for too long. When dawn came, I peeled off my damp shirt, folded it neatly, and set it on the chair. I looked out at the grapevine, brittle and bare under the snow, and made a promise, to myself, not to them. I would never ask for another thing in that house again. My silence would change its shape. It would no longer be weakness. It would become a weapon. If you're still watching and your heart's pounding with what just happened, leave a number 3 in the comments. The story's about to take a turn that no one saw coming. The next morning, I woke before the sun. The house was silent, wrapped in that half-dark stillness before everyone else begins their day. My shirt from the night before hung over the chair, stiff from dried water. I didn't touch it. Instead, I shaved, brewed coffee, and tried to pretend that normal still existed. The smell of pancakes drifted from Ethan's kitchen. Madison's voice floated through the wall, sharp and cheerful, as if laughter could erase what had happened. When I stepped into the hallway, Ethan glanced up briefly from his phone, muttered a dry, "Morning," and went back to scrolling. The children avoided looking at me, their cereal bowls suddenly fascinating. It wasn't anger that hit me, it was the emptiness. No apology, no acknowledgement. Just life continuing, as though the water on my face had never dried. I sat at the table, poured myself a cup, and said, "Ethan, about last night." He interrupted without lifting his head. "Let's not talk about it, okay? It's done. It's done." The words landed heavier than the water had. Final, cold, like a door shutting in a storm. I nodded, though my jaw tightened. The rest of breakfast passed in fragments of noise. The scrape of forks, the hum of the refrigerator, the chatter of kids who had already learned silence from their parents. When they left for the day, I remained seated long after the sound of their car faded down the street. I stared at the steam curling from my cup until it vanished, just like my place in that house. The hours that followed blurred into chores. I fixed a loose hinge on the back door, swept the porch, trimmed the grapevines that had survived the frost. Work had always steadied me, but even the rhythm of the hammer couldn't drown the echo of that phrase. It's done. By late afternoon, Madison came home from errands. She barely glanced at me, just said, "Door was locked. Don't forget your keys next time." Even though I hadn't locked it, her tone made it clear. The locked door wasn't an accident. It was a message. I was no longer part of their household. I was an intrusion politely tolerated. That evening I tried again. I cooked a pot roast, something hearty that filled the air with warmth. When they returned, I invited them to eat. Madison smiled tight. "We already ordered takeout," she said. Ethan added, "You don't need to do all that, Dad." The dad sounded obligatory, like a title held out of habit. They took their food into the living room and shut the door. The silence after was suffocating. I sat at the table alone, the roast untouched, the clock ticking too loudly. For the first time, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was numb. And numbness, I learned, is more dangerous than pain. It means something inside has begun to change shape. The next day, I walked into town. Snow had melted to slush and the sky hung low and gray. At the corner diner, I found Sam Jenkins sitting in his usual booth. He was an old mechanic, a friend from years back, one of the few who still called me Walt instead of Sir. When he saw me, he grinned and waved me over. We talked about small things at first: weather, sports, the slow death of good coffee in small towns. But then he looked at me closely and said, "You look tired, Walt. You okay?" I hesitated before answering. "Just family stuff," Sam snorted softly. "Ain't that always the hardest kind?" He leaned back, stirring his coffee. "You built half this town, didn't you? Don't let anyone make you feel like a tenant in your own life." His words hit somewhere deep. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear them. For the first time in days, my shoulders loosened. When I got home, I went straight to my workshop. Dust covered the old filing cabinet where I kept papers I hadn't opened in years. Deeds, savings accounts, retirement records. I sat down and began to read. Line by line, I traced my name. Each document carried the same truth. I still owned it all. The house, the land, the accounts Ethan thought were his inheritance already. My pulse steadied. I remembered sitting in that bank years ago, signing the forms that made Ethan a joint holder. The manager had asked, "Are you sure?" And I'd smiled like a fool and said, "He's my son." That trust had felt unbreakable then. Now it was armor I hadn't realized I still wore. By evening, I had stacked the documents neatly in a folder and placed them on my desk. I didn't feel triumphant yet, only certain. For years, silence had meant submission. But that night, as I closed the drawer, it meant preparation. Ethan thought he'd erased my dignity, that I'd fade quietly into the background. What he didn't know was that every act of dismissal had given me a lesson in control. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to fight. I just needed to wait and act when no one saw me coming. I went to bed early, the house dark and still. Through the thin wall, I could hear faint laughter from their side. It no longer hurt the way it once had. It only reminded me of timing, how laughter always sounds loudest before the silence that follows. That night, for the first time in months, I slept soundly. Not because things were fixed, but because I had remembered something important. Power doesn't disappear. Sometimes it just waits in the quiet until you're ready to reclaim it. If you're still watching and connecting with every emotion so far, comment number 4 below so I know you're with me. What's about to happen next will change everything forever. The days that followed blurred together, each one quieter than the last. But beneath that quiet, something dangerous was forming. Ethan grew bolder, louder. He had stopped pretending that we were equals under one roof. Now, he acted as though my presence existed only to serve his pride. When friends came over, he would pour them drinks and say things like, "Dad's retired now, living the easy life. I make sure he's comfortable." Every lie was a knife wrapped in a compliment. I heard him through the walls, bragging about business deals funded by accounts that bore my name. He boasted that his company truck, his boat, his new grill, all came from his hard work. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of him pacing the backyard on the phone, laughing, calling me the old man who finally learned to sit still. I used to find comfort in silence. Now, it sounded like surrender. Then came the weekend barbecue. He'd invited half the neighborhood to show off his new smoker. I wasn't asked to help, but I went outside anyway, carrying a small tray of lemonade. Old habits die hard. The yard was full, music, laughter, kids running between lawn chairs. For a while, it felt almost normal, but normal never lasts long when arrogance needs an audience. When the food was served, Ethan called for attention, lifting a glass of beer. "To hard work and family," he said, clinking glasses. "And to my old man here for finally relaxing after all these years." Laughter followed. Then he added, "Guess I should thank him for teaching me how not to waste my life carrying bricks for pennies." The crowd chuckled, thinking it was a joke. Madison's smile froze halfway, but she didn't stop him. My hands tightened around the lemonade tray. The ice rattled like tiny bells of warning. Someone asked if I missed working. Ethan jumped in before I could answer. "Nah," he said. "He's lucky he's got me. I take care of the bills now. He just gets to enjoy the leftovers." The laughter returned, light, careless, cruel. For them, it was harmless banter. For me, it was the sound of every sacrifice I'd made being erased in real time. I felt the world tilt slightly, the smell of charcoal mixed with humiliation. My chest burned, not from anger, but from realization. He wasn't my son anymore. He was a stranger wearing my last name. I didn't speak. I didn't walk away. I simply stood there until the laughter turned awkward and faded. Then I set the tray down and went back inside. No one noticed. They just kept eating. In my room, the air felt colder. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floorboards. My hands had built those floors decades ago. Every nail, every plank, laid with care. And now the man who lived above them treated me like a stain to be scrubbed off. For the first time, I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt awake. The humiliation wasn't a wound anymore. It was a map. Every moment of disrespect pointed to one truth I could no longer ignore. The time for forgiveness had passed. I stood, walked to the desk, and pulled out the folder, the one with my life inside it. The paper smelled faintly of dust and ink. Property deeds, bank statements, investment records. My name, Walter Grant, appeared again and again, alone at the top of every page. Ethan's name sat smaller, secondary, sometimes only as authorized user. I traced my signature with my thumb and felt something stir inside me, a calmness I hadn't known in years. I began reading line by line, confirming what I already suspected. Every asset, every account, every piece of property still legally belonged to me. He had nothing. He had never had anything except what I allowed. The thought should have hurt. Instead, it steadied me. The years I'd spent believing he held power over me suddenly seemed ridiculous. He was living inside a castle built by my hands, and I was the one apologizing for breathing. That realization didn't make me furious. It made me certain. I walked to the mirror again, the same one that had reflected my shame weeks earlier. The man staring back this time wasn't beaten. His eyes were clear, steady, and tired in a different way. The kind of tired that precedes action. I whispered, "If he wanted a lesson, I'll give him one he'll never forget." I found a notebook in the drawer, the same one I used to track grocery expenses. I turned to a blank page and wrote one sentence at the top: "Take everything back." Beneath it, I started outlining steps, not emotional ones, but logistical. Call the bank, verify authority, secure documents, prepare transfer, leave quietly. I underlined that last part twice. By the time the laughter outside faded, the plan was already taking shape in my mind. Not anger, not vengeance, just balance. A return to what was mine. I closed the notebook, slid it under the folder, and turned off the light. The night settled thick and heavy around me. Through the window, I could still see the faint glow of the barbecue fire dying in the yard. Let it burn, I thought. Let him think he owns the flame. Soon, he'll find out who built the fire. The morning after the barbecue arrived with a deceptive calm. Sunlight slid across the kitchen tiles, catching the edge of the same table where my son had once thrown water in my face. Madison was humming while packing the kids' lunches. Ethan scrolled through his phone, grinning at something on the screen. To anyone else, it might have looked like a peaceful morning in a happy home, but to me, it was the quiet before a storm I had already set in motion. I poured myself coffee and watched them move around the kitchen. Their voices sounded distant, muffled, like echoes from another life. I no longer felt part of the scene. I was only observing, studying them as one studies people in a dream, close enough to see their faces but too far to touch them. Ethan laughed, told Madison about a business opportunity he wanted to jump on. He mentioned dipping into our savings, the ones he believed belonged to him. I took a sip of coffee to hide my smile. He still didn't know. After they left, I sat at the table, the steam rising from my cup fading into thin air. For years, I'd believed that love required endurance, that patience was strength. But now I understood that endurance without respect is servitude. I looked around the house, every corner built by my hands, every wall painted with money I had earned, and felt no warmth, only clarity. I opened my notebook. The list I'd written the night before stared back at me in clean, steady handwriting. 1. Transfer all joint funds to private accounts. 2. Remove Ethan's name from deeds and authorizations. 3. Notify lawyer to deliver letter after departure. 4. Leave quietly. The plan didn't feel vengeful. It felt efficient. Everything had a purpose, a logic. Ethan had lived years thinking my silence was surrender, but he never understood it was simply waiting for the day he would hand me the reason to act. Before I made the first call, I let myself remember. I remembered carrying him on my shoulders when he was 6, his laughter ringing in my ears. I remembered sitting outside his high school graduation, proud beyond words. I remembered signing the papers that gave him joint access to my accounts, believing I was teaching him trust. Each memory now felt like a faded photograph, proof of a man who no longer existed. I whispered, "You had everything, son. Now you'll have what you've earned, nothing." I picked up the phone and dialed the bank. The receptionist recognized my voice and transferred me to Mr. Reynolds, the branch manager I'd known for years. "Walter, good morning," he said warmly. "How's retirement treating you?" "Better starting today," I replied. "I'd like to review and update my account access. It's overdue." He didn't question it. Within minutes, I had an appointment for 2 o'clock that afternoon. My tone stayed calm, almost pleasant. When I hung up, my hands were steady. There was no trembling, no second-guessing, only the quiet certainty of a man reclaiming what was his. By midday, the house was empty again. I walked into my room, opened the drawer, and took out the folder that held my life's work. Deeds, investments, account ledgers. Every page was proof of the years I had given everything for my son's future. I read each line slowly, tracing my name, feeling its weight. It was still mine. Every signature, every stamp, every title. In the background, I heard Madison's laughter echo faintly through the hallway from a video she'd left playing on her tablet. It blended with the ticking of the clock. The sound no longer irritated me. It reminded me that soon, those echoes would fade from my world entirely. I placed my passport beside the folder, then the notebook, then a small envelope addressed to my lawyer. My life, neatly organized into 3 piles: past, present, and departure. As I zipped the leather bag shut, a strange peace settled over me. For years, my silence had been the sound of defeat. Today, it became the sound of precision. When Ethan returned home that evening, he was in a good mood. He bragged about landing a new client, said he'd use extra cash from the joint account to celebrate. I smiled faintly. "That's good, son," I said, my voice even. "You've worked hard." He didn't hear the meaning behind the words. He never did. Later, I stood by the window, watching the sun dip below the rooftops. The light turned everything gold for a moment, the same gold I'd once associated with hope. Now, it looked more like closure. I thought about what would happen tomorrow, how a few signatures would unravel his world, how every illusion he had built would vanish quietly while he slept. I locked my door for the night, not out of fear, but finality. The bag was packed, the plan complete. As I lay down, the air felt lighter. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a father waiting for his son's respect. I felt like a man reclaiming his name. Tomorrow, I would walk into that bank as a ghost of the man they thought they knew, and leave as the man I had always been. If you're still watching and this moment struck you hard, type number 5 in the comments. The decision that's coming next will test every bit of courage left. The morning light had a strange clarity to it, as if the world itself knew something final was about to happen. I woke before the alarm, dressed in my best jacket, and checked my bag one last time. Folder, passport, notebook, pen. The air inside my room was cool, clean, and still. For the first time in years, I felt no heaviness in my chest. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't hiding. I was simply leaving to finish something I'd started a long time ago. Ethan's voice floated faintly from the kitchen, full of careless energy. "Madison, make sure the bills go out today," he said. "I'll transfer more from the joint account later." His tone was confident, certain, unaware that by noon that account would no longer exist. I buttoned my coat, picked up my bag, and stepped outside without saying a word. The drive to the bank was quiet. Snow had melted into thin ribbons of water along the edges of the road. I parked beneath the old oak tree near the entrance, the same place I used to park when I was building this town, when my body was younger, my mind busier with hope than reflection. Now I was coming to reclaim what that hope had built. Mr. Reynolds, the bank manager, met me with a handshake. "Good to see you, Walter," he said. "I've got the documents ready." His tone was respectful, almost formal. He led me into a private office where a stack of folders sat neatly arranged on the desk. My name was printed on every page. The pen felt heavy but right in my hand. Each signature sounded soft and final, the faint scratch of ink echoing louder in my mind than any shout could have. The first form transferred every dollar from the joint accounts into a private account under my sole ownership. The second removed Ethan's access entirely. The third confirmed my property rights, the house deed, the vehicles, the investments. When I signed the last page, Mr. Reynolds looked up and nodded. "That's everything. You're the sole holder again." I smiled faintly. "I always was," I said. He hesitated, studying me. "Everything all right, Walter?" "This is a big change," I met his eyes. "Everything's just as it should be." When I stepped outside, the air smelled of rain and diesel. The world didn't look different, but I did. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, feeling sunlight touch my face, and thought how strange it was that such a monumental shift could happen so quietly. Years of humiliation erased in the time it took for ink to dry. I drove home slowly, letting the radio fill the silence. A song from decades ago played, a melody Marianne used to hum while cooking. I smiled, not from nostalgia, but from peace. I imagined her voice saying, "You finally did it, Walt. You finally stood up." Back at the house, Ethan was on the porch, laughing into his phone. "Yeah, man, business is good," he said. "I'll move some money later today and lock in the deal." His words chased me up the steps like echoes from another lifetime. He waved half-heartedly as I passed him, assuming I was just running errands. He had no idea that his empire had already been reduced to air. Inside, the house felt hollow. Madison was folding laundry in the living room. She barely glanced up when I entered. "You heading out again?" she asked. "Just taking care of a few things," I replied. My voice was even, calm. She nodded, uninterested, and went back to her task. The clatter of dishes and the rustle of fabric followed me down the hall. In my room, I placed the signed documents inside my suitcase, then sat at the small table by the window. I poured myself a glass of water, the same gesture that had once brought humiliation. This time, I drank slowly, deliberately, savoring the act. The taste was ordinary, but it felt like victory. That afternoon, I sent one final email to my lawyer, confirming the delivery instructions for the sealed letter. It was to be hand-delivered to Ethan 1 week after my departure. I kept the message brief, polite, professional, just business. As evening settled, the house filled with familiar noise, Madison scolding the kids, Ethan bragging about a new deal, the television murmuring in the background. I sat on the bed, suitcase packed at my feet, and listened without emotion. Their voices sounded distant, like a show I'd already watched too many times. Through the thin wall, Ethan said something about buying another car once the next payment cleared. Madison laughed. The irony was almost tender. They were dreaming on borrowed ground, living inside walls that were no longer theirs. I looked around my room, bare walls, faded curtains, the dent in the chair where I'd spent countless nights in silence. It wasn't home anymore. It was a waiting room. I whispered to the empty air, "Let them sleep easy tonight. Tomorrow, their world wakes up empty." Outside, the wind shifted, brushing the vines along the fence. The old trellis creaked softly, like the house itself was sighing in relief. I turned off the lamp, lay back, and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of their voices pressing down on me. I only felt the steady rhythm of the clock beside the bed, tick, 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 counting down the hours until freedom. And as sleep began to pull me under, one thought stayed clear in my mind. Justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it comes in silence, signed in ink, and sealed with peace. Morning came soft and golden, spilling through the thin curtains like forgiveness. I woke before the alarm, though I hadn't truly slept. There was no need. The kind of calm that comes after a long storm had settled over me. Quiet, heavy, absolute. I made coffee, packed my suitcase, and sat for a moment at the edge of my bed, watching the steam curl into the air. I wasn't running away. I was simply walking out of a life that no longer belonged to me. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of pipes. I moved through each room slowly, touching the edges of furniture, the framed photographs that had faded over the years. One picture stopped me, the one of Ethan as a boy, standing beside a half-built fence I'd made with my own hands. His smile then was wide and innocent. I traced the glass with my finger. "You were worth everything once," I whispered. Then I set it face down and kept walking. In the garage, my old tools hung in neat rows, a museum of labor. I ran a hand over the hammer, the saw, the level. Every mark on them was a scar from a lifetime of work. I thought about how many times those same hands had built something to make Ethan's life easier. His first treehouse, the table where he ate his dinners, the house he now called his own. And yet none of it felt bitter. The anger had burned out days ago. All that was left was clarity. I locked the garage and drove downtown for one last appointment. Mr. Harlan, my lawyer, met me with his usual calm professionalism. His office smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. I placed the sealed envelope on his desk. He looked at it, then at me. "You're sure you want this delivered after you're gone?" he asked. "I'm sure," I said. "Not before. It's meant for understanding, not for argument." He nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing with the kind of respect men rarely show anymore. "You've always been a patient man, Walter. I suppose this is what patience looks like when it's done." I smiled faintly. Patience isn't quiet, it's planning. He didn't press further, he just shook my hand firmly. "Safe travels then." Outside, the wind carried the smell of rain. I stopped by a small cafe and withdrew small amounts of cash from different ATMs on the way home. Every withdrawal felt symbolic, peeling away the last layers of my old life. No one paid attention to the old man moving from machine to machine. I was invisible again, but this time it didn't hurt. It helped. Back at the house, the day had begun to fade. The light through the windows had the dim orange of memory. I printed my flight confirmation. Lisbon, one way, departing tomorrow morning. The word departure on the ticket didn't frighten me. It felt honest. I showered, trimmed my beard, and dressed in clean clothes. When I looked into the mirror, I saw someone I hadn't seen in years. A man standing straight, eyes clear, carrying neither shame nor expectation. The reflection wasn't of a father, or a victim, or an old man waiting for kindness. It was of someone free. As the evening settled, I made myself a simple dinner. Soup and bread, the kind of meal I could finish without appetite or regret. From the other side of the wall came the familiar sound of laughter. Ethan and Madison watching television, their voices mixing with the static. It didn't sting anymore. Their laughter no longer belonged to me, and I no longer wanted it. I took one last walk through the yard. The vines I had once pruned were bare, their twisted branches clinging stubbornly to the trellis. The soil smelled of rain and endings. I knelt briefly, pressed my palm into the earth, and whispered, "Thank you." Not for what had been lost, but for what it had taught me. When I returned inside, I turned off every light, leaving only the lamp by my bedside. I placed my suitcase near the door, my passport and wallet on the nightstand, and the leather bag with my documents beside the chair. I didn't leave a note. There was nothing left to explain. Silence would speak loud enough. Before bed, I sat by the window and looked out at the dark outline of the house across the yard. Ethan's domain of arrogance and noise. I felt no hatred, only distance, like watching a storm from across the ocean. The glow of their living room flickered faintly against the glass. For a moment, I imagined him still talking about his next business plan, still believing the world waited for him to act. Tomorrow, he would learn what waiting really means. The clock ticked softly beside me. I whispered, "It's time," and the words felt lighter than breath. At dawn, I rose, dressed quietly, and slipped out through the front door. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet leaves. My suitcase wheels hummed softly against the pavement as I walked toward the waiting taxi. I didn't look back when the driver asked, "Where to?" "The airport," I said. As the car pulled away, I watched the house shrink in the rearview mirror until it disappeared behind the curve of the street. I thought I might feel sorrow or triumph, but what I felt instead was peace. Pure, unadorned, absolute. For the first time in my life, I wasn't leaving something behind. I was walking toward myself. If you're still watching and can feel the calm before the storm, drop a number 6 below. What follows will show that sometimes silence speaks louder than revenge. The morning after I left, the sun rose over the same house that had once been mine, but something inside it had already changed. Ethan woke to the sound of Madison shouting from the kitchen. The coffee machine wasn't working, and her voice trembled as she said, "The card got declined." Ethan, half awake, laughed. "That can't be right. Try the other one." She did. Same result. Moments later, his phone began to buzz. Notifications piled up. Emails marked urgent from the bank. He frowned, scrolling through them. Account changes confirmed, authorization revoked, ownership transferred. The words blurred together. He blinked, confused. What the hell? He called the bank immediately, pacing the living room in his robe. "This must be some mistake," he barked. "You froze the wrong account. My father's name is on it, but I'm the primary user." Mr. Reynolds' voice came through the line, calm and steady. "Good morning, Mr. Grant. There's no mistake. The accounts and property deeds are under the sole ownership of Mr. Walter Grant. You were listed as a secondary signer, not an owner." "That's ridiculous," Ethan shouted. "He's retired. He wouldn't even know how to—" "Sir," Reynolds interrupted gently, "the paperwork was finalized yesterday. Everything was signed in person by Mr. Grant. I was there myself." Silence filled the room. Ethan's mind scrambled to make sense of it, but the math didn't work. The man he had called weak, irrelevant, and old had just taken everything back with a pen stroke. Madison appeared in the doorway, pale. "What's going on, Ethan?" He didn't answer. Instead, he slammed his phone down on the counter. "He can't do this. He can't just—" But he could. And he had. Madison crossed her arms, her voice sharp. "You told me the house was ours. You told me we were secure. I'll fix it," he snapped. "I just need to talk to him." But Walter Grant was already gone. Hours passed in chaos. Madison made frantic calls to the bank, the credit card company, even the insurance office. Each response was the same. Mr. Walter Grant is the sole owner. By afternoon, their bills had bounced. Their car payments froze. The illusion of control dissolved as quickly as their temper. When the doorbell rang, Ethan opened it expecting another delivery notice. Instead, he found a man in a gray suit holding an envelope. "Delivery for Mr. Ethan Grant," the man said, "from the office of Harlan and Associates." Ethan took it without a word. His hands shook as he unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was unmistakable, calm, deliberate, mine, Ethan. "This house was never yours to take, only to inherit through gratitude. You mistook kindness for weakness and generosity for surrender. What you had was trust. What you lost was respect. I haven't taken anything from you. I've only returned what was never yours to claim. The money, the home, the comfort, all of it was meant to teach you responsibility. You failed that lesson. Maybe this one will reach you instead. I leave you not with anger, but with a truth I wish someone had taught me earlier. Respect is the only inheritance worth keeping. Take care of your family, if you can. I'll take care of my peace. Walter Grant." The paper crumpled slightly under his grip. Madison read over his shoulder, her lips pressed into a thin line. For once, she had nothing to say. In the silence that followed, the house seemed to shrink around them. Every piece of furniture, every framed photo, every echo of laughter now carried someone else's name. The children watched from the hallway, their eyes wide and confused. Madison turned away, whispering, You did this." Ethan sank into a chair, staring at the letter. For the first time, the weight of his arrogance settled fully on his shoulders. He wasn't angry anymore, just hollow. Miles away, on a quiet street in Lisbon, I was sitting on a balcony overlooking the sea. The air smelled of salt and bread, the chatter of locals mixing with the distant sound of waves. I had rented a small apartment near the port. Nothing grand, just enough for a table, a bed, and peace. Every morning since I'd arrived, I walked along the waterfront, watching the fishermen cast their lines as the sun rose. Sometimes I'd buy a loaf of bread from the old woman at the corner bakery and share it with the stray cat that waited near the steps. Life had become simple again, and for the first time in decades, simplicity felt like wealth. One evening, as the sky turned gold over the Atlantic, I sat with a glass of wine and read the last words I'd written in my notebook. I didn't win by destroying him. I won by choosing myself. The sound of the waves filled the silence that followed. I lifted my glass toward the horizon and whispered, "To freedom." Somewhere far away, I knew Ethan was learning what freedom truly costs. And as the sun slipped below the edge of the water, I realized I'd finally found something better than revenge: peace. Weeks passed quietly after I arrived in Portugal. The rhythm of my life had changed from noise to peace, from survival to stillness. Each morning, I woke to the sound of seagulls outside my window and the scent of the ocean drifting through the curtains. I brewed a pot of coffee, carried it to the small balcony, and watched the sunlight climb over the rooftops of Lisbon. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing anywhere. I wasn't waiting for anyone. The silence wasn't empty, it was whole. In those early days, I still thought about Ethan, but less with anger and more with understanding. I realized that revenge was never what I truly wanted. What I had craved all along was acknowledgement, a simple thank you, a touch of gratitude, a moment of respect. When that never came, I mistook justice for vengeance. Yet standing here, surrounded by salt air and foreign skies, I understood that justice had nothing to do with punishment. Justice was the act of finally choosing myself. I walked the same narrow street each morning, nodding to shopkeepers who began to recognize me. There was a bakery at the corner where an old woman sold warm bread. She always smiled, even when we didn't share a language. It reminded me how kindness doesn't need translation. I would carry the loaf under my arm and walk toward the pier, watching fishermen prepare their nets. They worked with quiet purpose, no pride, no boasting, just hands and patience. I admired that. Maybe peace was just that simple, doing what you must without demanding applause. As the days stretched on, I stopped checking my phone altogether. There were no messages from Ethan anymore, and I didn't expect any. The lawyer had confirmed that the transition was complete. The house, the accounts, the investments, everything had returned to its rightful place. I didn't need to see his reaction. I already knew it. What mattered wasn't his downfall, but my deliverance. Sometimes, late at night, when the sea wind rattled the window panes, I caught myself wondering if he had learned anything. Did he look at the empty rooms and remember the man who built them? Did he sit at the same table and think of the night he threw water in my face? I hoped so. But even if he didn't, it no longer burdened me. Some lessons don't bloom in time to save the teacher. I learned something profound in my solitude, that love without respect is hollow, and generosity without boundaries is an invitation to be broken. For years, I believed that being a good father meant giving everything, even my pride. But pride, I've come to realize, isn't arrogance. It's the spine that keeps your soul standing upright. When I bent too far, I taught him that my worth could be discarded. When I stood again, I reminded both of us that dignity is not negotiable. Wealth is measured in many currencies. My son thought it came from numbers and possessions. But wealth, the kind that endures, comes from silence that doesn't ache, from mornings that don't begin with fear, from knowing that you belong to yourself. Money can buy comfort, but only peace can make it mean something. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, I walked along the shore. The sand was cool beneath my feet, and each wave erased the prints I left behind. Watching that, I thought about forgiveness. People often say forgiveness is for the other person, but I disagree. Forgiveness is a way of setting your own heart free from the weight of bitterness. I didn't need to call Ethan to forgive him. I forgave him by no longer letting his actions define my days. The sea glimmered gold and silver under the fading light. Children's laughter echoed somewhere behind me, mingling with the rhythmic pulse of the waves. I paused to breathe it in, the sound, the scent, the peace. I realized that I had spent a lifetime fighting for everyone else's comfort while denying my own. It took humiliation, loss, and a plane ticket to teach me that freedom sometimes wears the quiet face of solitude. I no longer felt the urge to explain myself or to justify my choices. I had given enough words to people who didn't listen. Now I lived by actions, small, simple, dignified actions that no one could mock or misuse. As the last light faded, I raised my eyes to the endless water and whispered, "Peace doesn't come when they apologize. It comes when you stop needing them to." The tide rolled in, washing over my footprints once more, carrying them away into the vast blue that stretched beyond sight. I turned back toward my small apartment, the sound of waves following me like a lullaby. For the first time in a very long time, the world felt quiet, and so did I. These turning points remind us that setting boundaries and valuing ourselves is not just an act of courage, it's the foundation of living with dignity. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's one lesson from this story that you feel connected to, and how will you apply it in your own life? Let's grow together by sharing our thoughts. If this story resonated with you, drop a 1 in the comments. If not, feel free to leave a 0. Your feedback helps us improve. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and spark reflection. Thank you for watching, and here's to living life with strength, honesty, and authenticity.